Yeah.
All right, thank you, Zara. It's great to be here. We've got a great set of people here lined up for this panel discussion around surveys and their effectiveness. I think we'll just start off with and have everyone go around and introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about who they are, what their background is, and then we'll launch into a series of questions, which ironically is going to be in the form of a survey. We'll ask several questions to everyone and get their opinions, and hopefully, as we come out of this, we'll have a consensus as to the effectiveness of surveys within our industry. So to start off with, I'll introduce myself. I am Jacob Howell. I work with a company called Subex, and I've recently joined them. I'm the VP of Business Solutions and Consulting for the Americas. And I'm also a longtime member of the CFCA, going back probably at least 15 years. And for the last nearly that same amount of time, I've been involved with leading the CFCA's Global Fraud Loss Survey. And I also happen to serve on the executive committee as the executive secretary for the Communications Fraud Control Association. All right, then let's kick it off next to Jason, who's also been involved in a number of surveys for a long time. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. So Jason Lane Sellers, I'm the Director of Market Planning for LexisNexis Risk Solutions. Been involved with the CFCA, like Jacob, for many years now, close to 20 years now. And in that time, been involved with both the survey from a CFCA point of view, but also other surveys with other associations. So been involved with the GSMA and run various surveys as part of being their intelligence group, and also with the TMF and their fraud management group several years ago. Within LexisNexis, we also do our own kind of fraud surveys and updates as well, and reports. We have our cybercrime report that we give out to the industry twice a year, but we also do a true cost of fraud survey, focusing on retail, physical, and financial marketplaces, and looking at the true cost of fraud, and we do that annually as well. So therefore have several insights to approaches to surveys. Rene?
Rene Philbert, very happy to meet you all and excited to be in this panel. I'm heading internal audit at TietoEVRY. It is the largest IT solution provider in the Nordics. And my function is totally focused on data. So we are data-driven business partnering function. My background is from auditing and consulting, from two of the big four. And actually, most of my 20 years of career I've spent in the telco space. And surveys, I've got acquainted with and I've been leading and transforming the TM Forum's revenue assurance survey for many years. And I love data and I love to run surveys. Currently, we do an organization-wide survey running actually with 24,000 employees.
All right, and Jussi.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Jussi Makela, also very pleased to be here. So thank you very much for having me. I'm the director of ITW Global Leaders Forum, which is an industry organization representing the executive commercial leadership of large international carriers across the world. And for us, we undertake a number of different types of activities in our attempt to advance the notion of interoperability, the ubiquitous connectivity, and also to generally to work to improve the business environment for not just obviously for the carriers, but for everyone. And amongst a number of our different initiatives, key focus for us is fraud and our activities to reduce fraud. So in that we have been publishing our annual fraud report for 3 years now. The GLF itself is a relatively new organization, will be only around for the over 4 years. And during that time, we've we've launched and published 3 fraud reports, and this is an annual feature for us as well, and working very closely. Happy that we also strategic partner with CFCA, and we work very closely with them as well in terms of sharing of information, sharing of the insights that we get from each other reports. But we also use surveys for other types of thought leadership material that we produced, for instance, around diversity, looking at that, and then also more on a more ad hoc basis, anything to do with the the impact of COVID to office working, to how do we see the future of settlement of inter-carrier services. So that's me in a nutshell.
All right, thanks, Jussi. Let's stay with that topic here and talk a little bit more about why we do surveys. You mentioned a couple of reasons and things that types of surveys that you do within your organization. So I'll throw it out to the rest of the group and ask you, what's the motivation behind the surveys that you've done in the past? Jason, what are your thoughts?
Yep. So we're all being polite and seeing who was going to go first. Yes, from that perspective, I think the usual driver is that we want to know something. Now it can either be very focused, we want to know something specific, or generally, and I think a lot of the things I've been involved with from the fraud perspective have been what is going on in the industry. And it's very hard to share, it has been very hard to share specific information on fraud. So therefore, it's usually use a survey, utilizing surveys, utilizing some methodology of how do we find the general gist of what's happening, both globally, regionally, different marketplaces, different services. And a survey kind of gives us that way to do that in terms of finding out, as I say, what is going on, what is happening, what are the latest issues, what are the what is the situation, and over time map that into trends of how changes are happening, occurring, and can we look and utilize that information to predict and estimate what's going to happen going forward as well.
Rene?
Yeah, just to add to Jason as well, as I've done association-related surveys as well. Actually, I had a very personal motivation. I came into the revenue assurance space, and in my org, I was actually responsible for fraud management as well, and a few other roles. So I wanted to drive change. I wanted to wake up the people, the professionals in the industry, actually widen the scope and achieve a better understanding. And that actually led into a business assurance discipline, and really challenging me day to day on do I understand what's in that box, or am I able to look outside in? Actually, there are 2 other things I wanted to add here. Painting the big picture, really to get additional data points that, like in our organization at the moment, we think we don't have those data points, but starting to plan a survey and starting to do in a collaborative way, actually, talking around the organization, you will find additional data points where we already have a substantive data. It's just not used for that purpose. And at the same time, I have a possibility to actually widen my personal horizon and adding other perspectives into the big picture. And lastly, I wanted to mention, I use surveys also for very sensitive topics. Like currently we are running a culture audit, actually, and you mentioned diversity. It is one of the topics that we look into. But another area on culture is also the behaviors, and the sometimes not so good behaviors of leaders. We're not always walking the talk, which is of course very bad, but there we have a possibility to ask really sensitive questions in a totally anonymous way, and really understanding, for example, why people are stopped, they don't speak up anymore. It would be very, very important to have not only empowered employees, but people who are speaking up. And and a motivation, as I said already, driving change through the data. To summarize this, driving change.
Yeah. So, thank you, Rene. I want to pick up on one of the things you touched on very briefly. You talked about how surveys can increase collaboration across the industry. And so I'd be curious, Jussi, what are your thoughts on on the effectiveness of surveys and driving collaboration and driving change across the industry. What's been your experience?
I've got very
Oh.
positive experience. Or sorry,
Go
someone
ahead.
else wanted to talk.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yep. So very positive experience. Basically, you can through a survey, you have a tool to wake up a whole community, right? And giving kind of a sounding board to them, involving the people as well, like what we did in the Revenue Assurance TM forum. We haven't even had any sponsors, right? But a lot of us actually did free work because we wanted to understand the data before we actually drive the change. And that has been a super collaborative environment, and I still have a lot of friends, personally and professionally from that time.
Okay, yeah, I had similar experiences as well. Jussi, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this absolutely has a positive impact in the sense, provided that the organizations do it in the same way and with a view of using it in terms of like driving something better. But what it obviously enables is this the increase of the understanding within the state of the industry, and then also it allows the opportunity of sharing what we have in terms of and also ability to find gaps that might exist, and I don't mean gaps in the sort of that one survey is not necessarily done in the right way, but in the sense that there are different types of communities who have a ultimately similar focus areas, but might be coming from a slightly different angle. So having this kind of industry level data that you can share actually helps to sort of make collaboration more meaningful, rather than just a statement of, yes, we all agree on the same thing, let's collaborate, but what do we do then? Well, one of the clear things is that, okay, we are all doing these sort of things, trying to understand the way of the world. Let's help each other to kind of like in our quest to understand that. So that's key. And the other as well is a sort of why we're doing surveys is, of course, the ability, especially for industry associations, with the view of we do have an agenda in terms of doing this. We do potentially see quite often a view of the world that we want to achieve, which in our case I would like hope to see that it's a positive. It's also a use of looking at measuring whether it's actually what we are doing, is it actually having any kind of an impact what we are doing. So because if we do tend to do the surveys all the time and we are not seeing any impact, maybe it sort of helps us to actually figure out better that we need to do something differently.
Yeah, so yeah, you talked about survey effectiveness and measuring change. How do we measure the success of a survey? What are some of the measures? What are some of your thoughts about the success of our surveys that we do? Let's kick it over to Jason here. What do you think, Jason? How do you know if your survey has been successful?
Yeah, I think with any survey, I think, as we've all said, your initial aim or target is depending on what that is in terms of how you're gathering information. So if we take a generic fraud survey, we might be wishing to get a picture of the state of the industry. So a successful survey is, are you getting a clear picture? Are you getting a definition of what is going on, where it's happening, that you can draw conclusions from, draw references from? You just touch upon collaboration. It might be highlighting that you need to kind of work and collaborate with a different industry, a different vertical. The crossover, if we take fraud, the crossover of fraud across industries like banking and finance with telco, for example. But it's, can you get a clear, defined picture that's reasonably statistically significant in those areas, covering a broad enough range? Depending, as I say, it really is depending on your outline of your goals. So if you're after a kind of global view, then you need to make sure that the survey is reaching the regions and environments you want. If you're wishing a view in telecoms, we need to make sure it's reaching a good variation, a good spectrum of different organizations that are providing different services. There's no point going for a global telecoms view and then only talking to providers of wireless services, for example, because you'll only have a specific view. If we're looking for a specific focus, we're focusing on, interconnect fraud, for example, then we may want to make sure that we're covering that in a particular aspect and getting a general picture of those who are responsible for that area, who those have an understanding of that area. So it really is driven by the definition of what your outline is in terms of what you're driving for a survey, what insight and your goals you're wishing to achieve, and then the inference from that data that you can get in terms of having the right kind of spectrum of respondents, the type of questions you ask, the detail in those questions. Are you getting the answers? Are you getting specifics on those answers as much as you can in terms of the environment, and then being able to draw the relevant conclusions from that and back those up with the data. I'm sure others will have other comments as well to add to that.
Rene, you see?
Yeah, that resonates with my points as well. And of course, having a far enough reach with the survey, having sufficient response rate, which are also part of the goal setting. And a bit more technically spoken, what I tried to get out of the surveys is a quantitative data, and really to get insights that you can actually correlate with other questions. So for example, with background profiling type of questions. So, technically spoken, once you see the data and you start analyzing it, then you can see whether it really worked out. Also analyzing the distributions. If you have a five scale, 5-point scale, you can see approximately whether the distribution is according to the hypothesis that you have made before. A bit more generally spoken, what's always great and which takes additional energy is actually to proactively collect feedback. And we've done that in the TM Forum survey with the community, actually quite widely, question by question. We even during the conferences talked about the questions, and talked about the bias that we had in the questions, the unexpected results, interpretation problems, and I could actually then fix that directly for the next survey. And especially when you do a survey like a revenue assurance and fraud management survey, it's very important that you have some of the data points you always carry forward every year or every second year whenever you do the survey, so that you can actually see the trends, because people want to see the trends and start to get used to common definitions as well. That may be a little bit different now in the culture survey that we do right now, but there is more focus on actually setting up the hypothesis, looking at the correlations of data points. You don't necessarily expect any correlations to happen, and really find the causalities. So to find the sort of levers for the change. That makes it very exciting.
Good.
I fully agree with everything that's said, and I think from it depends. Obviously, it's always the kind of like what's the purpose of this in terms of, so you have one is the sort of statistical, sort of like, do I think that I have a good enough representation here in my data set that I can draw conclusions or not? So that is just something kind of like, did the marketing of the survey, did we end up with that? And it's also the right people, and it's not just necessarily the number of individuals, but it has to be the kind of right individuals. So do we have that? Do I have any confidence in the results? It's always good to get something that you can surprise an expert in the sort of result, especially if you're confident of the result, that they go like, oh, I did not expect that to be the result, and that's quite interesting. But at the same time, if it also confirms what you were expecting, it's equally, if you have a boring set of results saying exactly what you were going to say, that's successful in a way as well, because it's, it kind of like tells you that, your sort of assumptions to begin with were the right ones.
I think just to add to what Jussi said there, I think that aspect of who is responding to a survey is very important. So if you're doing an internal survey, say culturing, you got a good control in terms of getting staff to respond, etc., and covering the right number of staff. If you're doing a generic survey across industry, then it's making sure you're actually getting the right people to respond as well, the right kind of level of individuals who will know the detail. Let's say from a telco perspective, let's use telco because that's what we're talking about here. is, you want the telco managers, the fraud managers responding. You don't necessarily want consultants or independents responding with their view of the industry, because they're not on the ground actually doing the job. You need people who are doing the job, who have the day-to-day impact, the day-to-day view of what is going on. So you need to be, having that kind of element of view of who you're targeting. So it's not necessarily you need hundreds of thousands of respondents. You can have a limited number of respondents, as long as they're the right people covering the right kind of demographics of what we need.
You raised a good point, Jason. In the CFCA survey, we're careful to distribute the survey to carrier members, those people on the front line who are researching fraud, investigating fraud, because they're the ones who can tell us really what's happening in the business and across the industry. And we're careful not to allow the vendors themselves to respond to those surveys out of fear that those could bias the results. And so this is a really interesting question I'd like to spend a little time on, is how do we avoid biases coming into our surveys? I think each of us, from our respective parts of the world, have our own perspective on what's happening in the industry. And I'm just kind of curious to see what are some of the things that you do to maybe prevent bias from creeping into your surveys and to ensure that it's giving truly an accurate picture across the industry. Let's, Rene, what does the Team Forum do there?
I think there has been a lot of focus on the frameworks. A lot of focus on the frameworks and on the definitions. So to have a common definition, of course, you could say that to a certain extent the bias is already in the model, but of course there are always new questions as well, and there is a lot of collaboration around ensuring outside in thinking, so to make sure that the topics are really balanced. And I think it's very important to have simplicity, right? To have very simple questions in the survey, very specific to a topic. And what has been mentioned before as well is that there is very clear structure and very clear objectives behind. And actually, what I typically do is I even I define areas and sub areas, and each of the areas sub areas has their own objectives, and each question has an objective as well. Also to think again, do we have the right objectives when we aggregate again the sub areas into areas? And yeah, balancing questions, being very concrete with the answers as well, not missing out anything, and you reach this through a collaborative approach and with a lot of testing before you actually launch it.
I think the bias question is, and I think it's very relevant, especially in the sort of areas of what we experience as well. And it goes to the earlier point, is that it's important who you talk to. And I'm sure we all seen these sort of, when we've done the reports, and especially we've seen which focused on the carrier community, is that if you do speak to, let's say, the fraud manager, which is absolutely the relevant person or the fraud team to answer some of these questions, are they in themselves actually a bias on the behavior of the organization? Because you have a large telco. What if you go and talk to the salespeople and say, like, actually, really, what is it that you do? And do you actually follow? And are you actually focused on the sort of same thing? So inherently, you'll probably end up, when you're doing, especially in an industry association sense, is that, what is a view of a company that has 100,000 employees and different divisions and billions and billions of dollars at stake? Yeah, you probably, it doesn't have a single view. It might have an official view, but how the behavior is, and that's actually quite difficult. And I think managing is, we can try and manage it, but I think it's also important that we make a disclaimer on, this is what this. Obviously not telling what company and what individual said, but we kind of like provide a disclaimer to the reader as well, is that this represents the view of these organizations and the type of individuals that responded, and people can then obviously use that and make their conclusion based on that.
Jason,
I think it's the good points from both my colleagues there in terms of that. That aspect of how you construct the survey as well, or and again, if we take the experience of the CFCA survey or the generic industry surveys we've done, is making sure you've got that collaborative approach. Is there's multiple people inputting into the aims and the goals and the target for the survey, the construction of the questions, the construction of the focus points, and then the back end analysis as well. So you're getting different points of view and not drawing, it's not an individual drawing conclusions from the data, that there's a kind of a multiple viewpoint at each stage. I think for the broader kind of spectrum surveys, it's important to have that kind of broad overview and how you construct it and how you then destruct the kind of information coming back and the results coming back as well, to make sure that you don't overtly bias. I mean, I know Jacob, me and yourself have worked together with others when looking at the results of the CFCA survey, and we can go down different routes, but kind of come to kind of a combined conclusion then that kind of balances out the kind of points of view from the different kind of marketplaces. And if we do that with multiple people involving that, and again, kind of relevant people that reflect kind of cross-industry perspective, when we're doing a cross-industry kind of survey, it kind of helps align come at that point of view. I think Jussi's point in terms of, if we're doing a fraud survey from a fraud perspective, then there's going to be a bias in terms of expectation of fraud. But I think over the time, we've also proved that the fact that where we've shown fraud has gone down and fraud has gone up over different periods, it's not a kind of self-promotion point of view. We are kind of trying to reflect the results. So, if the fact that your results over periods of time kind of show those variations and show those differences, you can show that actually there's not an inherent bias, and you're just trying to promote, aspect of fraud is bad, for example, on a fraud scenario. That there are kind of good aspects and relevant aspects that kind of outweigh each other.
So you raise a really interesting question here about bias and making sure that you can analyze the data and you can come to hopefully an unbiased perspective of what's happening. I don't know if we'll be able to totally remove bias from the equation, because we all have our own perspectives on the various issues that are impacting the industry. But I want to ask another question, a follow-up question. And that's like, how can we trust the results from a survey? Obviously, a survey around fraud management's going to talk a lot about fraud, and how do we, ensure that people can trust the results that we're going to be reporting on? I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. Rene, what are your thoughts? Or you say go ahead.
Jussi, go ahead, please.
No, I was just saying, I think clearly it is the reputation and the sort of motivations of the organizations doing the surveys probably, clear. It's sort of like you mentioned, having vendors, and not that the vendors wouldn't have a valuable input in all of this, but clearly it's one of these cases that you don't ask your barber whether you need a haircut or not. It's a sort of that kind of a thing. So it's about, I think it has to do the organization, and that's the sort of like the responsibility of organizations and associations to ensure that there is that there's integrity in what we're always trying to do, and not let the agendas of others to influence it too much. And over time, I'm sure it will show.
Yeah, there's some technical aspects as well. Every member, especially during the revenue assurance survey, we've been actually looking into the data set and doing consistency checks. So what answer combinations don't make sense at all, right? And some of the records are actually to be eliminated because otherwise it would make it make the results a bit more watery, I would say. I'm actually doing a totally new approach now in a current survey I do in our company. We have a co-validation approach. So we take subject matter experts, we take executives, and we take employees. So together with them, we actually try to put the results into their business context. So they're trying to validate what does that question mean. That also addresses some of the bias that we may have in there. And of course, increases very much the collaboration around, recognizing what are the problems, the biggest problems that we have, and motivating leadership for change.
Okay, great. it's a really interesting approach.
Yeah, and I think I'm gonna kind of add to what kind of Jussi's comment as well in terms of one of the comments was over a period of time. I think working in an association, working with associations over it's an element. If you're doing a survey and that's providing the result, the analysis of the survey by the end users of that information is kind of drives whether it's value, whether it becomes trusted, and if you can repeat that consistency over periods of time, which is of course something we'd love to say about the CFCA survey over a period of time. Over the years that we've done it, it's been very consistent. The way we've managed it's been consistently applied. The way we've kind of done the interaction has been consistent. A lot of the kind of questions have consistency and new development, which means you kind of get a view of it's not wildly varying in terms of the data set that's coming out. It is becoming kind of a year, I say year upon year, biannually kind of becoming very, very, very much aligned. And then you can then map that against what else you see in the marketplace as well, in terms of what is happening generally. So, other associations are doing their similar types of surveys. Are they reflecting the same? Are there differences? Are there wild variations? Are there kind of elements of that where they've had a particular focus and maybe, going back into that, they've therefore had that bias and skewed their kind of results of what's coming out and averse to what we're seeing. And I think 4 years ago, wasn't it, Jacob? I'm going to be kind of personal in terms of we had the drop. There's the slight drop into the consistent drop, then a rise, and then another drop in kind of fraud elements over the period of time. And the kind of question was, well, with the media impact of fraud, how can we be saying fraud is going down when everybody else is saying fraud is going up? But it aligned because it aligned in terms of what we saw when we could reflect and analyze it, of how some of the shifts in attack patterns had gone. They'd gone to different industries. So generic fraud was out there and fraud was in the media, but specific telecoms attacks had changed their pattern and changed their way of operating. So the fact that we can actually back it up and validate and provided a level of trust to the people utilizing the survey, actually, that information is trustworthy, should we say, and can be consistent over that period of time.
Yeah, no, you raise a really interesting point, and I agree. Over the years that the CFCA has been doing their surveys, we have seen some, macroeconomic changes where the types of fraud are in the past are not always the same ones that are happening today. The attack vectors are shifting more toward the subscribers themselves rather than the networks and technical types of fraud. So let's spend a little more time on that. I wanted to ask about for your opinions on our surveys. Do you think that we're asking the right types of coverage questions? If we consistently ask the same questions that we've asked in the past, we'll get the same answers. But as you know, the industry is shifting and it's changing. We've seen this in years past, and it will continue to change in the future. So I'm curious about your thoughts about the questions that we're asking, and if we're giving covering the industry with our questions and our surveys adequately. Rene, what?
Yeah, I could start with this. Yeah, my memory is on the revenue assurance survey, of course, and I was invited to several meetings, also of other associations, to talk about, and there was always the first question, like, what is the revenue assurance percentage? Like, is it going up? Is it going down? Is it 1%? Is it 1.5%? And I've always hated those questions because it depends, right? The response is going to be depends. It depends on how people have understood the coverage, depends on how the people who took the survey have access to their own data, whether it's inside their direct responsibilities, whether they are using the same definition or the same process framework that the association is using. We've actually been trying to guide the survey takers with a maturity model, which would have helped them to really assess and use the sort of common language. What I find more important is to actually say, okay, here is a trend, right? So revenue assurance, revenue leakage went down from 1.5 to 1.2%. So it seems to be a trend, right? And everybody will agree, yes, it's a trend. But then to look at the underlying areas, and of course also where we're not totally clear about the coverage. So to go into more concrete areas where it's really interesting. So new services versus existing services, mobile type of services or IoT. So then it's starting to be really interesting. And there you will actually find the factors which come from more emerging sort of areas, which have not been in the past in the coverage picture. And that's the most exciting sort of discussion to understand not how well we have done our job in the last 5-10 years doing exactly the same thing, but how well we have been covering the change.
Great. Jussi, what are your thoughts about the questions?
I think
Coverage.
I think it's just what Rene outlined was sort of makes total sense, and I think it's always the kind of like the difficulty as well, going back to the kind of like keeping your consistency of your data set to able to kind of monitor changes with these emerging trends. So how do you make the shift? Are we asking the right questions? If you ask me to mark my own homework, yes, absolutely, we are asking the right questions. But whether we will be, for how long can we ask these questions, and how do you actually deal with when you sort of realize something that your view of the world is is changing. That how do you adapt, especially if you're doing like an annual survey. Of course, if you're doing ad hoc ones, you're much more freer to do things as you wish. But I think especially on those sort of annual, like CFCA, which is a sort of like an industry benchmark, that's then that you kind of like you need to maintain the consistency, but then think about these new emerging trends, and how do you ensure that? I think it's maybe there's a question of having a survey on a survey, or asking like surveying people to say like, is our survey good or not? So it's a difficult question, and I don't have an answer in all honesty.
Yeah. I think you kind of touched upon a point there, Jussi, even though you didn't think you had an answer, is that aspect of flexibility. So again, the purpose of your survey, like you like Jussi mentioned, an industry kind of benchmarking survey, which is what we've kind of become to create in the CFCA, that you have an element of 75% probably is going to be consistent going on year to year, with a 25% of new and developing kind of questions approaching those new areas. Now, it doesn't mean that same 75% of those questions sit through every version. It's it's changeable as it goes through, but it allows you to track and develop the changes. So elements that are no longer relevant can drop out, and new elements can come in. But the core of what the information is allows that kind of viewpoint. And I think Jussi and Rene mentioned it, where we kind of benchmarking ourselves, and if we're using it to benchmark, then it's a consistency is kind of needed, and the validity of what we're asking and who we're asking needs to be needed, so we can compare against each other as well. Yes, that is very different when you're doing a very specific kind of touch point survey on, I'd say, a specific problem, specific issue, or a specific point in time. Then that is you're creating those questions for that point. That really is not something you have to kind of worry about kind of consistency of questions going forward, because it is that kind of touch point in time. But it's just having that flexibility in what you're going to ask. Be willing to drop some things out because it's no longer relevant. So you're not getting a dropout of responses because 50% of the survey is not relevant. So they're kind of thinking, why am I even bothering wasting the time? Versus kind of making sure you are including the new and latest issues, but enough consistency so you can track things over time as well, because that's important to all of us in terms of those generic kind of fraud surveys, those benchmarking surveys. We want to see what is happening globally, how things are changing, and then compare where we stand in our marketplace, in our industry. So if we're in the wireless space, how we're comparing against other wireless providers, how we're comparing in the US versus North America, versus EMEA, versus Africa, because there are, and are there trends that are happening in those regions that are going to be coming our way, or did it happen in one region first and then spread across over a period of time? So there's all those elements that we're looking for to come out of that data as well.
Yeah. So as I look out across the panel here, and I realize that we've done lots of surveys over the years amongst the group of us here, and so I guess a follow-up question would be: do you think that we have too many surveys? not enough surveys? What are your thoughts on the number of surveys that we have out there, and are they still even relevant and valuable to continue?
Yeah, a very good question. I also still wanted to reflect Jussi and Jason, so I fully agree.
Sure.
And it's really the sort of change trends that's very interesting, and actually also very motivating for survey participants to go in and to self-reflect on okay, when it comes to coverage, am I covering this to a sufficient level or not? Okay, so survey for fatigue, the next topic.
Yeah.
Or doing
real.
the same survey and thinking, okay, maybe I'm going to have the same answer, so I'm not quite sure whether I'm going to benefit or whether the association is going to benefit from. Yes, there are a lot of surveys. I would say when you have a good survey, you can run as many as possible, and of course they should be relevant. Both of you, Jason and Jussi, mentioned that the sort of being a customer oriented here. So having relevant questions will be very important. Nothing worse than to mark half an hour in your calendar prioritizing a survey, and halfway you think, okay, man, I'm half through. I have no idea. And most of the questions are not relevant for us. So that's a killer, right, to be avoided. But short surveys, try to make the questions relevant. Of course, also use the background profiling questions to have more specific sets of questions for the really relevant people. So not necessarily, in my view, too many surveys, but maybe too many bad surveys.
Fair enough. Jason.
Yeah, I've got to say, I think I reflected. So who's fatigued of online meetings now? And I think that's the key. It's when it happens of surveys happen, and they're happening all at once. So spacing out like we do with the I'm going to use the CFCA survey and pat you on the back, Jacob, in terms of we do it once every 2 years. Now people are screaming at us, can you do it every year? Can you do it more regularly? It's like, yes, we could do, but who would then respond? Because it does take time to respond. It is effort, and we want a clear picture, and we want a concise picture, and we want that information coming back. So it's balancing that fatigue versus benefit and capability of getting a good survey in place. There's companies like my own company that do their own surveys as well, which add to the other industries as well do their own surveys. At least I think, from the CFCA perspective, with the CFCA survey, we're trying to work with the other associations. So, we are very collaborative and willing to work with the associations, share the data, share the results out, have those associations contribute to the question building, the analysis, etc., and work together. Not for one to own it outright, but actually just show, look, this is all the industry coming together. So we don't have to run 5 or 6 separate surveys, one for each industry, asking the same things. So where we can collaborate and make that work effectively, then of course it's worthwhile. But I think there is that aspect of how do we avoid fatigue, and Rene touched upon nicely how we want to do avoid those kind of questions and that kind of scenario. But I think it's a matter of being applicable in terms of the context of what you're doing. So for our CFCA survey, where we're looking at trends, and once every year, once every 2 years, you could argue between the two. We do it for 2 years to prevent that fatigue from people. Specific scenarios, specific issues, you've got to make sure it's short, sharp, and sweet, and focused to the point in that respect, and that will try and avoid some of that fatigue. But as I just reflect back to now, Teams meetings, Zoom meetings, online webinars. I think we're all kind of burnt out in those kind of scenarios. So we've got to make sure that when we're doing the surveys, we look at what's happening elsewhere to make sure we're not contributing to that kind of fatigue.
And then, Jason, if I may, of course, there is always a challenge not to reach the expected outliers, like the leaders and the laggers, right? If you do a fraud, if you have a fraud question, so asking the guys on how much fraud have you got, and if you are missing the top 2 in your survey this year who have participated in the last year, you have a little problem. So you kind of, even though when you do it totally anonymously, and that's the challenge when you do it anonymously, when you actually don't know whether, who has taken the survey, but whenever possible, if you're not undermining psychological safety, or there are no really secrets in industry, that then it would be really great to have more profiling, so really know who are the people are. Otherwise, the results could be a little bit skewed. And we've had such challenges as well in the TM Forum revenue assurance survey in one instance, where you still could see the trend, but the values were a little bit skewed.
Yep. You say.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with both Rene's and Jason's viewpoints on it's all about is the bad surveys. Like there's 2 things. There's one thing is like survey fatigue of filling surveys, whether there's survey fatigue of reading them is as well as like I'm all for, let's have as much data and information as possible, and that's okay. But of course there's frustration when you have these, especially in our industries, this complete waste of time. Quite often some commercial player who comes up saying, how 80% of CEOs say that 5G is going to be important, which is like, yeah, really, sort of thanks for doing the survey and actually asking people to, waste this, time to do something like that. But it's all about the kind of the good surveys and bad surveys, and and how do you and maybe there's a kind of like technology there to help as well. But there is definitely a risk is that we as an industry double up quite a lot on similar things. So I fully agree with what Jason was saying, is that it would be good for us to coordinate, not us necessarily, but as a kind of industry that we work together on these similar topics.
Yeah, I've been pleasantly surprised to see the consistency across all of our surveys. We're generally reporting the same trends and the same types of things. So that's a validation that our surveys are producing value, that we're reporting a consistent picture about what's happening across the industry. So as we think about our surveys, and looking at the time here, as we think about the surveys that we've done in the past, let's look to the future here. And I'm just curious to get your thoughts about, where do we go from here? What does the future hold in store for our surveys? You think we'll continue to do the same surveys, or do you think that they'll need to maybe change the format, change the types of things that we're asking for, the frequency? Just kind of curious for your thoughts about the future of the surveys that we're going to be doing. Rene,
yeah,
thoughts about that?
And definitely expecting huge changes, of course, and there are new tools and new technologies that you can use as well.
Okay.
A couple of years back, people were teaching that you need to have a quantitative, like responses like 1 to 5, and very clearly, very much like it, or I cannot say whether I like it or I don't like it, or I don't like it and I don't like it at all. But it will be more also AI based, right? So you can ask open questions in a certain context, and actually just run a sentiment analysis, all sorts of tools already around to actually capture from a really wide data set on what are the subjects and what are the related sentiments. Definitely AI-based analytics, more open questions will be very interesting, where you can even mine the context out of it. I mean, kind of you mine the structure on top of the responses. Then I see a trend of more the sort of vector diagrams. So you kind of you move your cursor from one to another. So the visual sort of surveys I've seen so far. Then audio and video related elements. And of course, what will be very interesting is to see the emotions people have throughout taking a survey, and to interpret the emotions as well. When it comes to analytics, we work very much with interactive dashboards and getting the dots together and making sure you can actually do the drill down. And I guess also towards the survey takers, there will be more real-time interaction, maybe not totally real-time because you first need to have the data, but more interaction as well, so you can drill down and drill through and extract. I see the future as extremely positive and for shared collaborative learnings.
Yes, I'm excited for some of those new technologies and the opportunities we have to find these stories and be able to share those stories that will come out of the data. Jason.
So I think Rene's covered the technical side of things. Obviously, there'll be technological developments along the lines, but I think again it comes back to that key of the purpose of the survey. So if we look at again, let's use the CFCA survey. That's a consistent one, or even like the LexisNexis True Cost of Fraud survey, which we do annually. It's become that benchmark standard of information that's out there in the marketplace. So in terms of that, the future of that, in terms of there's always at the moment, there's always a need because there is no other information out there. Fraud, particularly, information is not shared freely in terms of the cost and impacts and how the frauds are going on. So therefore, for us in an industry, we have no other points of comparison. So having that consistency there, something we can go to for that point of comparison, that point of analysis, that verification of what is going on or where we think is going on, where we need to invest, where we need to improve, where we need to ensure we've got coverage, etc. I think that will always be there. So that the future of the survey, I think, is going to be valid still for a period of time until more information becomes more open. How we do it, technically, it may change, and in terms of getting more advanced in terms of how we can analyze that, get it more real time, more interactive. That may encourage then the capability for that to happen more regularly. So not necessarily be biannual, to be more up to date. If it makes it simpler if the technology makes it simpler for people to contribute, that may enable that kind of viewpoint to be every quarter, every half a year, that kind of scenario, depending on that. But I think the kind of core consistency of what we need those surveys for is still there from the generic industry trend point of view. It's kind of different for those instant touch points. I think the technology will probably apply to those a lot quicker in terms of getting that instant viewpoint from the marketplace of what it's doing, which obviously if you're doing it in an organization or doing in a specific market space or utilizing social media kind of touch points, those are things you can do there and then. I think for our kind of generic kind of fraud trend marketplace surveys, the kind of future is consistent for the short term at least.
I don't have anything to add to these points. It would be interesting to like some of these questions when it requires basically some sort of a data to come from your organization. How far you could actually automate that. Some of those are also having kind of alignment. So maybe there's a bigger question like having an alignment on KPIs that we look at and having, and of course there are some of these sort of black box services. But whether some of these things we could be more utilize some of these, then it wouldn't become such an arduous, and you would move more towards almost kind of like a real time results could be interesting as well.
Yeah, Jussi, that's an excellent point. I wanted to reiterate as well. Really getting, finding new data sources and turning them into ongoing measurements. Of course, there's a huge potential to actually collect data like that. And I see that as one of the motivators as well to run surveys inside an organization to actually provide additional data points and real-time data for decision making.
Yeah, great comments. I think we've had a great discussion here. Let's just go around the room one last time, and we'll give you each like 60 seconds to share maybe any parting comments, any last thoughts, and then we'll wrap up here. Rene, are there any last comments, last things you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, I could kind of share my takeaways, and just linking to, it's very easy. It's nowadays very, very easy to create a survey. Everyone can do it. 10 years back, it was pretty difficult, but with the new tools, easy to create, easy to or very fast to launch, and very, very fast to lose trust. And we have to be super carefully because not our own trust is at stake, but also our company's trust. And you will never ever do a survey again when you have done a bad survey, or you will do it and nobody will respond to it. And my takeaways are: make sure you have a clear purpose. That was very well reflected by my colleagues as well. So communicate very clearly, actually, in relation to the actions, what you're going to change, right, based on the data. What is very sensitive here in the Nordics, the trust in the data and the processing. We are extremely strict in the Nordics and in Europe around GDPR. Need to be really clear on how the processing is being done, how the data is protected and archived or actually purged. Second point, transparency end to end. Be really clear with the objectives. So work with objectives, area objectives, sub-area objectives, objectives for each question if possible. When you have a possibility to do run your hypothesis, do it. And try to use that consistency as well in the reports and provide that transparency. Third and last point, clarity. So use a common language, no jargon, common language.
Good comments, thank you. Jussi, do you have any closing comments?
I think going back to the point again with regarding that, from a surveyor, is a kind of ensure that we need to have good surveys, and we need to continue to have good surveys, and we need to avoid and have fewer of the bad surveys, as Rene said. But also when you're responding to these, it's the pick the kind of surveys as organizations you actually want to participate, and make sure that your response good. So it's also the kind of like, from an industry perspective, that is that you sort of focus on the ones that are actually adding value and all that, and next time somebody asks, is 5G going to be instrumental, you can sort of leave those kind of surveys next to it. And this is not against anything, but it's just to kind of ensure that we will continue to have something which moves the industry and helps us all in our business.
All right, great, thank you. And Jason.
So I think Rene's covered the technical side and Jussi's covered the quality side. I'll cover the aspect for me then is that aspect of look at us in this panel, who we represent and who we have represented over the past, is that aspect of collaboration. And by working together to make sure these surveys are focused, technically correct and appropriate, will mean we can create a trusted environment that we can repeat again and again and again going forward. And we're not in conflict, we're not working against each other, working together to do so. And that is, I think, very important for the elements we mentioned earlier about establishing the trust, establishing the validity, and its credibility as these things go forward over time. And the CFCA have been here 35 years. The survey's been running close to 20 years now, but we've always, and we do always engage with the wider industry to make sure that contribution is there and make sure that understanding is there. And that is something that is absolutely essential and has to continue. And we'll continue to work with other organizations and hope they will work with us as well going forward.
Yeah, thank you. Great notes to finish on. Thank you, Jason. We're excited for the future, excited to look back and see the progress that we've made and the value that we brought to the industry, and excited for many more years of collaboration going forward into the future. And with that, Sarah, I think we'll kick it back over to you.